All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to It's Knowable, a channel dedicated to exploring the intersection of truth, beauty, and Catholicism. I'm really excited to welcome you back this evening in particular to our next episode of It's Knowable Presents. I'm really excited. In just a few minutes, we're going to welcome on Michael Lofton, the founder and host of Reason and Theology, to discuss defending the church without ignoring her faults. This is a topic I think um, deserves, it sort of it gathers a lot of attention in some sense, but I think at the same time maybe doesn't get enough attention, or at least I believe that I continue to get questions asked by people, whether Catholics or non-Catholics, that sort of hint at kind of wanting a better understanding, of this subject. So I think that it's gonna be a really important thing to talk about. So um, just to give a little bit of an overview, we're going to start by just doing an interview. So I think probably around 5 after the hour here, I hope to start the interview. And then we will go for about an hour. And then during that process, if you all have any questions, please do add them to the chat. And I'll be sure to kind of monitor those. Most likely, they will not be answered kind of as they come in, but we'll kind of have a time at the end, a 30-minute section or so, where I'll try to incorporate some of them, whichever ones I can that are relevant. So, and then just as a little bit of a teaser while we get going here, I want to also let you know that on the 1st of August, so coming up here in just a few days, I'll be hosting Austin Suggs of Gospel Simplicity right here on this channel. So a similar sort of style interview, but he and I are going to be just talking about the future of ecumenism. So we're going to be talking, about the sort of the state of ecumenism now, sort of that is the sort of ecumenical Christianity with all its denominations, and then we are going to also be talking about the sort of the future of that, sort of what reasonable hopes might look like in that context. So. So with that in mind, and I apologize, I am dragging my feet just a little bit. I know Michael will be hopping on here in just a minute, but let's see. So I guess with that, he is on now. I apologize. He's logging on now. Excuse me. So with that in mind, if you all have any questions, please do start start adding them to the chat. I think it'll probably be helpful for me to just sort of get an idea of that. But I guess if I can, I'll just take this minute to just mention that this It's Knowable Present series is my in-depth interview series. So these are in-depth but casual conversations with insightful voices about topics that I think merit our attention, or at least topics that have captured my attention. So as I mentioned earlier, the channel itself is dedicated to exploring the intersection of truth, beauty, and Catholicism. So all of the topics are going to be kind of in that realm. And I'm not always necessarily including all three of those kind of focuses, but certainly I would imagine at least one of them. So if you all have any ideas for that, I think at this early stage in the channel, it'd be very easy for me to kind of incorporate ideas. So it would definitely be a good time to kind of to recommend those. So with that said, let's see. Michael is in the green room, so let me add him. I'm still learning, but I'm almost got the eCam thing down. So Michael, I've almost got it down. All right, can you hear me, sir?
I can. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you so much for being on with me. I'm getting a little bit better every time. I felt really badly. Gary Machuda was on with me for like my first one with this sort of new fancy setup, so to speak. Yeah. And I was sort of fumbling my way through the beginning. Of course, he was incredibly gracious and all sorts of things, and gave me pointers after the fact. But anyways, you got the
problem.
Slightly
sorry
more
I'm
polished
a few minutes
version.
late here.
What's that, bud?
I said I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late.
No, it's okay. It gave me a good opportunity to sort of rehearse my intro, right? That was one of the things that Gary told me about, because I was sort of struggling with like what to do organically and what to do kind
Mhm.
of very formulaically, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, just get that, like, just that intro bit, just get a little bit that you say every single time at the beginning, and then you kind of dive right into it, and it
Mhm.
helps. It helps. I think it helped. I don't know.
For sure.
I'll let the people tell me later, but I sort of introduced you just briefly, kind of before you jumped on. But I'm really happy to introduce you to everyone who doesn't know you. You're the founder of Michael Lofton is the founder of Reason and Theology. It's a channel that I've been following for a couple years now, and a channel that I've learned a lot from. And I've actually gotten to know Michael a little bit as well through my work across the Tiber. He's been very gracious and volunteered his time to talk with our passengers as well. So it's really, really fantastic to kind of get to know you on that personal and professional side, so to speak, or as an audience member, and then also kind of alongside, so to speak. So could you give us a little bit more color, though, just for the people who aren't familiar with you? Like, who are you? What's your work about? Kind of what makes you tick?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. So I started Reason and Theology as an apologetics channel back in 2019. And at the time I was still kind of working through some theological issues, but I settled into my confidence in the Catholic Church within a good year of doing Reason and Theology. And so I kind of shifted the channel more from initially kind of being a debate discussion channel to more an apologetics channel that promotes the Catholic position. Um, and so I've been doing that, yeah, since January of 2019. And I'm an Eastern Catholic, so I've also had experience in the Latin Rite. So I've kind of seen both sides, experienced both of them, and appreciate both of them. So I kind of come from a balanced perspective that sees both of those lungs of the church and breathes through both of them, or at least I try to. Um, and I'm also working on my doctoral dissertation, which concentrates on the topic of the magisterium, or the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. So I have a special focus on that topic and anything related to the teaching authority of the church, as well as engaging Protestantism and Eastern Orthodox, since I have a background with them as well.
No, yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's actually a large part of why I'm so excited to talk to you in particular about this, because I think you have a very unique vantage point, having had such a unique progression, and it's been a very kind of understandable. I mean, from my vantage point now, looking back, at least, it's very understandable and very rational progression.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting to kind of think about that, those kind of very real intellectual changes, intellectual conversions, and religious conversions also as well, I guess, because you're a convert. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So I was previously a Protestant, and
Hmm.
discerned my way into Catholicism, but kind of had to grapple with Eastern Orthodoxy as well. And for a short period of time, I actually joined the Eastern Orthodox communion when I became disillusioned with the Catholic Church and a lot of things that were taking place in it, and I was just incredibly scandalized. So I had a experience in Eastern Orthodoxy, but the more I just continued to study the issues, the more I realized the necessity of being in communion with Rome, which I, returned to communion with Rome and cherish to this day. And one of the things I try to do is help other people not make that same mistake, because there's a lot of people who are dissatisfied with the Catholic Church today, and they're tempted to go to greener pastures, when in reality the other pastures aren't really greener. But you only find that out later. So I'm trying to help people not make those same mistakes that I made.
No, that's really powerful, and I think there's a powerful witness there, right? When you can kind of say, like, "Look, I've made these mistakes. Like, I know what to look out for. Like, please trust me." Like, I'm not just sort of like criticizing without knowing, right?
Right.
Because I feel that way a lot. Myself coming from Protestantism to
Mhm.
Catholicism, I can really sympathize a lot of times, like with where they're coming from, because I mean, oftentimes it's echoing things that I myself once said, right? But at
Sure.
the same time, it's also hard because, like, being in that position, you're also so eager to correct. I mean, lovingly correct,
Yeah.
right? And
Sure. Yeah, that's certainly my experience. I used to be, I used to kind of have that radical traditionalist position. I was pretty vocal about it,
mm,
especially as late as 2015. I was writing articles for well-known online journals that promote this material. And I just kind of saw where it led me. And, I retraced my steps over the years, but I'm seeing a lot of people make those same mistakes and making the same claims that I used to make. And I kind of want to pull them to the side and say, look, this isn't new. I was saying this years ago, and I wasn't even the first then. Many people have been saying this, and here's why we're wrong about it. Here's why you can be confident in the Catholic Church, and so on.
No, I mean that's a really admirable calling, and as someone myself, I was drawn, at least on the emotional motivation front. I was drawn in large part by Christ's command for to remain one as He and the Father are one. I mean that was a powerful thing
Hmm.
to me. Reflecting on that as a Protestant, and ultimately deciding that like being convicted that I wasn't truly part of that unity that was being commanded. I mean, that was sort of the personal, emotional side, right? There was sort of many theological battles to be overcome, but that's something that matters deeply to me, and it's something that we try to promote in our work across the Tiber. And but it's not an easy battle, as you know
Hmm.
better than most. And you mentioned, I'm kind of glad that you mentioned right at the beginning the scandals, kind of being fully
Hmm.
aware of the scandals present in the church prior to entering. How did you overcome that? I mean, sort of like, or maybe starting off, like, how did that give you pause? I mean, sort of like, what were you thinking about, like, when you're looking at the church, when you're sort of drawn to these truth claims, these beautiful arguments, all these beautiful products, and yet there's all this scandal? Like, kind of, how did you address
Yeah.
that? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, because when I converted to the Catholic Church in 2012, I was aware of a fair amount of scandals. So I already kind of knew going in, at least to a certain extent. But what I did is I just said, look, I'm going to keep my eyes on the prize, and ultimately, you have to judge these kinds of questions based on truth claims, not necessarily based on what kind of experience you have or what somebody does, because you could have a great experience perhaps in Islam, but that doesn't mean Islam is true. And you could have a horrible experience in Christianity. That doesn't mean Christianity is false.
Mm,
It really kind of boils down to truth claims and assessing those objectively rather than emotional or subjective experiences, however important those may be. And I don't want to discount them or play them down, but ultimately, the truth is the truth, regardless of how people treat you or what you see or what kind of scandals you experience. Now, I knew that going in, but after about a good 5 years of constantly having to endure not only scandals in the church abroad, but experiencing them and
mm.
having been treated in some cases very unjustly by some members of the church, after a while, it began to make me ask the question, well, um, I'm convinced of Catholicism on paper, but my experience isn't really matching up with what reality isn't matching up with what I see on
Yeah.
paper. Paper Catholicism and what I'm experiencing in Catholicism are two different things, and so maybe this is God's sign that I need to take a second look at Eastern Orthodoxy, which I did. But what I kind of learned in that process is, well, you're going to have the same problems in Eastern Orthodoxy. And even if you don't, even if you have a great experience, that doesn't determine the truth of these issues. You ultimately have to assess them objectively as truth claims, and those aren't really determined by experience. So, having seen that and learned that, I had to reevaluate these questions, and I realized the necessity of being in communion with Rome and the historical attestation to the papal claims, especially in the first millennium, which I think is the deal breaker between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism. If the papal claims are true, Catholicism is true. If the papal claims are false, then Catholicism is false, and Eastern Orthodoxy may or may not be true. Um,
Absolutely.
but I realized the papal claims are true, and so brought me back to the Catholic Church. So again, keeping my eyes back on the question, well, is this true? Not, well, how do I feel about these scandals in the church, or how do I feel about these things that have happened to me? That's kind of what helped keep me or bring me back to focus.
I think that's a really helpful distinction to kind of isolate them, as you mentioned, not to undermine the
Yeah,
importance of it or diminish it, of course not, but I think it is important to kind of put it in its place, so to speak. And that's really interesting because I kind of think about yeah, so you kind of have the emotional experiences. I think there's probably a
Mhm.
correlation not only with sort of the scandal that people think of in the secular world, the sort of the devastating sex scandal that the church has been part of, but also I think we think about it now kind of in more the sort of the liturgical crises that we see, the
Yeah,
sort of the modern scandals, so to speak. And sorry, not so to speak. I mean, there are scandalous instances. So
sure,
I don't want to
sure.
undermine them. I think I sometimes want to put caveats there before when I say such
Mhm.
things, right? But I think it's interesting because even there, I believe there's probably is a distinction between the sort of the feelings, right? The way that
Mhm.
a highly traditional liturgy makes you feel is actually different, perhaps from sort of the undermining sort of the underlying objective realities that might be contributing to your desire to be there, or what kind of is correlated to your
Mhm.
participation in it. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm certainly not. I love Latin, and I think the Latin Mass is beautiful. So if anyone's listening who doesn't know me, I'm certainly not implying anything negative about that, but I think there's a tendency to over sensationalize liturgy. I think that's probably what I'm getting at. And I think that can
Yeah.
be like, maybe there isn't an emotional character, even if it is kind of supported in history, and there's lots of good reasons. I don't know. Do you think I'm crazy there? Is there a connection?
No, I think what you're saying there's a lot of truth there. I do think in some instances, I probably overemphasize some particular practices, and overvalued them more
Mm,
than they really should have been. Not to put them down, but maybe I saw them as deal breakers when in fact they weren't.
mm,
On the other hand, however, I did experience some significant liturgical abuse that, looking back on it, I still say, well, yeah, it was right for me to decry those things. I'll give you an instance. I was the extraordinary minister of Holy Communion in one liturgy. And I remember seeing well, actually, no, in this instance, I wasn't serving as one, but I was one at the time. And I remember seeing an individual who was an extraordinary minister of communion spill the precious blood.
mm,
And that was a very serious concern. And I brought this to the attention of the priest and the bishop, and noted how, well, if there's going to be these difficulties in administering communion under both kinds per the Vatican, this should be avoided. In other words, the dispensation under both forms should be avoided until this is actually resolved. And in some cases, I didn't think that they were taking me very seriously. And so in those instances, I'll look back on them and I say that was a legitimate grievance.
mm.
Whereas in other instances, I think I was being overly scrupulous and a little too pharisaical in my complaints, and probably obnoxious in the way that I leveled my criticisms. And so I experienced that as well.
No, yeah, that's fair, and it's sort of it's funny because I was speaking very organically, right? This is not rehearsed or planned, so I'm sort
Sure,
of like thinking about these ideas out loud. Sometimes when I
sure.
hear it after the fact, I'm like, well, I don't know if I'll stand by that one quite,
Yeah.
because I think that I'm also very fortunate in the position I'm in, right? So I
Mhm,
frequent a Byzantine rite parish nearby our
mhm,
house with an absolute beautiful liturgy and incredibly reverent congregation, and then we also have a really lovely Novus Ordo that's
mhm,
incredibly reverent and quite respectful. People receiving, kneeling on the tongue and all sorts of kind of things that are kind of typically absent from sort of some of the more, I don't know what the word is. It's hard for me to talk about these things being a relatively new Catholic because I'm not always sure what the categories even are, right? Because there's Novus Order and then there's like the TLM, but then there's so many kind of like sub variations. You kind of get into these gradations. So that actually makes me like maybe get to a backup question here, just
mhm.
sort of a context question to help everyone, especially the people who aren't Catholic who are listening to
Yeah.
this. Like, can you just kind of like give us a little bit of an overview? Like, what is this kind of crisis in the church? Like, what is the kind of what's sort of the lay of the land right now with the church and
Mhm,
internally speaking, so the insider baseball stuff within reason.
mhm. Sure, yeah. Well, just a general overview, because this is clearly something we can talk about
Of course.
in depth, but just a general overview. What I've noticed is there tends to be two extremes in the church that are both causing a crisis in the church. One extreme is going to be what I would call the radical progressive position. And this is going to be the one that tries to detach the post conciliar, that is, the church after Vatican II. They try to detach it from anything prior to that. And they usually look on anything prior to Vatican II with suspicion or even contempt, and just kind of want to see Vatican II and everything after as just this new Pentecost, and everything that went before that was just not worthy of being preserved today. And so there's kind of this huge break in their mind to one degree or another with this camp. And so, and in many instances, they will attempt to transgress things that are biblical commands. So, you might see people in this category pushing for forms of immorality that are absolutely forbidden by divine law, not just church law, but divine law. In other words, sacred revelation reveals these are things that cannot be transgressed. They're immutable. They don't change. But you'll see some people kind of pushing the envelope here, and they're trying to advocate for things that God simply cannot allow. Whereas you tend to also find on the opposite extreme what I would call the radical traditionalists, or better put, maybe the pseudo traditionalists, because I don't think there's anything wrong with being radically traditional in one sense.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens with this group is they claim to be traditional, but in reality, they're anything but. They might have a veneer of piety and tradition to them, but in the name of tradition, they actually subvert sacred tradition. In the name of small t tradition, things that can be reformed, they end up subverting capital T, sacred traditions that cannot be reformed. And sometimes they'll confuse those two categories. And so, what you tend to find with this group is an extreme attitude that dissents against the teaching authority of the church, but in a way that's different from the other group. In this way, they'll try to say, we're the guardians of tradition, we're preserving tradition, and the teachers, the magisterium, even the Pope, they're not guarding tradition. And so we have to step in and do it for them. So whereas one group is just trying to say, well, we know that the magisterium teaches contrary to this, but we're going to go against it. The other group is saying, no, well, the magisterium isn't preserving the traditions, and so we have to go against the magisterium to preserve it. And this
Mm-hmm.
is why I call these two groups two sides to the same dissenting coin. They have the same problem, and that is dissent from the church, but they come at it from two very different perspectives. And so I think that those two groups are causing a great deal of confusion in the church. However, I will say this: the pseudo traditionalists, I think, are more reacting to the radical progressives. In other words, I think the radical progressives are the ones aggravating and initiating the confusion in the church. And what's happening is they're seeing people detaching themselves from tradition. And so they kind of go to the other extreme in reaction to that group and latch on to things that are, in fact, not necessarily things that are irreformable. And then they do so to the extent of even dissenting against the magisterium itself. So they're kind of in reaction to the radical progressives, and they're in one sense a product of it. If
Mm-hmm.
you didn't have these radical progressives, you probably wouldn't have the pseudo traditionalists.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I often think about sort of historical movements in terms of that reaction and often overreaction or counter reaction, I guess, in
Yeah.
the better sense of it. Terms. I think it's a very helpful. It's unfortunate that it happens that way, but it's also a very helpful framework to kind of sometimes, I think, a lens through which we can kind of understand these types of things better. And I'm glad that you mention it in that way. And I think that what you were describing about, the reformable and the irreformable, that really touches, I think, more accurately what I was kind of mentioning earlier about we were talking about earlier with the objective versus the subjective, right? It's like it's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely good and just to get attached to that which is irreformable, right? Like that's a
Mm-hmm.
just thing. Like we
Sure.
should kind of celebrate it. But then there's kind of like the small t traditions that like pious traditions and those types of things, and that's where there's kind of a different treatment of it, I guess, is needed.
Yeah.
Well, I want to kind of like dig in a little bit about these kind of the reactions and overreactions, because as is often the case, I imagine that there are valid criticisms kind of baked into some of these reactions and
Mm-hmm.
overreactions. So where do these movements kind of go wrong? I mean, in a sense, right, where this
Mm-hmm.
whole dialogue, right, is about defending the church without ignoring her faults. And to be
Mm-hmm.
sure, there's probably, I imagine there's legitimate faults to be criticized that these reactionary movements are responding to, right? And then they're kind of
Hmm.
overreacting to them and presenting something that is in itself a problem. And then
Hmm.
there's sometimes, then the actual truth gets obscured, right? Because then the original problem gets obscured by the equally problematic solution that's proposed, and then the actual solution or truth or whatever we're trying to find lies somewhere in the middle. So kind of like, where did they go wrong, so to speak? If you can kind of just speak really generally speaking, not about
Hmm.
individuals, but the movements.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that both positions, both sides, to one degree or another, because there are grades here, there are variations, but to one degree or another, they do have legitimate grievances, but they end up going too far with their reaction to them and the solutions that they propose to them. And where I think they go too far is it turns into dissent against the magisterium,
Mm,
which is the teaching authority of Christ Church. And whenever you have dissent against the magisterium, you now have dissent against the voice of Christ on earth, because you can see popes very clearly describing the magisterium, even in non infallible teachings, as the voice of Jesus on earth. You can, in fact, see this with Pius XII in Humani Generis, and he quotes Jesus from the Gospels when Jesus said to the apostles, "He who hears you hears me, he who doesn't hear you does not hear me, and him who sent me." And he takes that quote and he applies it explicitly to non infallible papal teachings. So he's not even saying, well, the voice of Christ is only present to, or is present here with these infallible teachings. He's saying, no, not only that, but the voice of Christ is also present here in these non-infallible teachings. And thus, it's a big deal to dissent against these things, especially publicly.
mm,
Now, there have been some things that the magisterium has said that balances that out just a little bit, but it doesn't ultimately take away from the point that Pius XII was substantiating there, and that is prohibiting public dissent against the magisterium, especially because what one is doing is they are dissenting against the voice of Christ on earth. And again, that's where I think both groups go too far. They set themselves up as their own magisterium in opposition to the magisterium, which is the Protestant error. Ultimately,
absolutely.
that is what Protestantism ultimately does: is it puts one's own conscience in opposition to the teaching authority of Christ in some instances, rather than saying, well, no, I'm going to conform my conscience and form my conscience to the teaching authority of the church. See, that's the Catholic response. The Catholic response says, well, if I have a disagreement, I'm going to form my conscience to be in line with the magisterium. Whereas the Protestant says otherwise. They say, no, if I have an opinion and interpretation about scripture and its meaning, and the magisterium conflicts with it, I go with my interpretation. So I think both of these groups are reinventing the Protestant problem.
Yeah, there's a couple things there that kind of stood out to me when you're describing it, that I think I have to like
Mhm.
zoom in on a little bit. And one is the public nature of the dissent. I think that's a really crucial
Mhm.
point. And then also
Mhm.
something that was sort of implied, and kind of relates also to kind of formal heresy, right? Is sort of the persistence, right? There's that element of persistence. So I don't
Yeah.
know. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that? Sort of the dangers of this sort of public dissent. Like, what's sort of distinctly problematic about the public nature, or what
Yeah.
dangers are distinctly present in public type criticism?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Because I think that, I mean, you deal with this all the time, right? I mean, you're someone
Mhm.
who has a large audience. You kind of are regularly putting out commentary, and you do, you are willing to criticize, certain aspects, kind of in respectful ways, and it's always
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
clear to me that you're still deferring to the
Mhm.
authority of the
Mhm.
church. So I
Mhm.
think that's an important way to
Mhm.
do it. I'm sort of curious, like, how do you approach that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're touching on a very important distinction here that I think a lot of people miss, and that is there is a difference between public criticism of the magisterium and public dissent. So the former, that is public criticism, is actually something that the Catholic Church itself allows,
Mm,
both in Canon 212, paragraph 3, and then also Donum Veritatis, which is a document on the role of the theologian. And it speaks about instances where a theologian may, in rare cases, withhold assent from the magisterium. Now, it does not advocate for public dissent, but withholding um, religious assent for non-infallible teachings are allowed in some exceptional cases for the theologian. And so what we notice in what the church has said on these things so far is that you do have a respectful criticism and questioning that can be offered. Whereas public dissent, more what Pius XII was getting at in Humani Generis, is not tolerated. So the difference would be, um, you know, with withholding of assent or struggling to assent to something and offering criticisms, that could look something like, well, I express publicly, or directly to my pastor, either way per Canon 212, either to the bishops or to others publicly. I express some of my concerns with some of the teachings or prudential decisions of the church. That's tolerated as long as one is respectful to the office of the leaders in the church, respecting their dignity especially. That's one thing, but it's quite another to just say, you know what, the magisterium is wrong and we need to fight against the magisterium. And the magisterium is evil and oppressive for teaching this, and we need to rebel against them. There's a huge difference between those two. The latter would be dissent, the former would be public criticism. And so, in the case of dissent, the church warns us against that. It especially warns in the document on the theologian and the role of the theologian. It especially warns against one using media to put pressure on the magisterium,
Mm.
which is what we're seeing a lot of people doing when they're dissenting from the church. They go on social media and they're doing, widespread videos to try to put pressure on the church to change something. And we see it from both sides, radical progressives and pseudo traditionalists. We see both of them doing this, but that's explicitly prohibited. But a lot of times they'll say, as their justification for doing this, they'll say, oh, but Canon 212, or oh, but Donum Veritatis. But in reality, those documents are only saying you can express some criticism in a respectful way, but they never allow for dissent and public dissent. In fact, I saw a theologian not long ago publicly advocating and saying it's healthy to have this public dissent.
Mm.
Um, and they cited some examples for it, but I thought ultimately it fails. But what I'm noticing is that a lot of people are under the impression that not only is this not sinful, that is public dissent, it's actually something good and
Yeah.
helpful for the church to reform itself.
Oh, that's really interesting. I have absolutely noticed what you just described, but didn't quite have, the words to kind of think about it. But you're absolutely right. And there's a because I've often kind of wondered about that. There's sort of the righteous indignation,
Mm-hmm.
or seeming, but it almost, of course, it becomes like a self-centered, perceived righteousness, of course, kind of in a sense. It's really fascinating. Yeah, this is. I mean, I think what you discussed most recently is what troubles me the most about it. But it's also something that has made me wonder if I've gone too far, kind of in the opposite direction. And that is, I mean, my kind of large fear as someone who is engaged so often in discourse with people who are non-Catholics, who are
Mm-hmm.
investigating church. My focus is so much on them as an audience, right? That's just
Mm-hmm.
who I am always thinking about as an audience. I'm thinking about non-Catholics, listening to this. And I have had countless conversations and fielded countless comments. And I mean that not just hyperbolically. I mean, maybe I could count them, but dozens of comments about people asking me and kind of expressing concerns about this public dissent that they're seeing, this kind of
Mm-hmm.
online internal warring, and it was causing them true concerns, like because we keep talking about the theological unity, we keep talking about ecclesial unity, the marks of the church, right? Like I'm thinking
Sure.
catechism, like I'm thinking as a catechist here,
Sure.
right? And then there's like this whole mess online, and so all I can think about is just like stop, like just stop, like it's not worth it, it's not worth, like even if some of the stuff you're saying is good, like it's just not worth it. Now I recognize though that like there is a place for criticism, right? Healthy criticism, charitable criticism, without dissenting. So when and kind of how do we know it's a good time for healthy criticism? Like
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. And by the way, your question reminds me of a scenario that I've often noticed. It's like we're not paying attention when we're offering some of these criticisms, and in fact dissent in some instances. It's like we're not considering, well, how does this look to non-Catholics who are looking in? We don't really consider that. And I pointed out not long ago that we're effectively telling non-Catholics two mutually contradictory claims in some instances. What
Hmm.
we're saying is you have to be a member of the Catholic Church or you can't be saved. And, we'll present that as outside the church, there is no salvation. Now, believe me, have studied the history on this thoroughly. So I understand that some people can exaggerate the meaning of that. But what they'll do is they'll say, well, outside the church, there is no salvation. And thus, you have to become a Catholic. And we're telling them that. But then on the other hand, we're also having these discussions about how the Pope is a heretic and he's worshiping idols and demons. And what we're telling the non Catholic is, well, in order to be saved, you have to be in communion with a heretic and a demon worshiper. And so it's a internally, inconsistent and contradictory position when we're presenting some of these things, which is why I tell people, well, I think you went wrong whenever this is the position that you're effectively conveying, and you're telling people they have to be saved in order, but in order to be saved, they have to be in communion with this heretic demon worshiper. It doesn't make any sense. But but I think your original question was, how do we know when to say
Yeah.
something? How do we know when to criticize? Um, Look, I don't think everything is wise to necessarily criticize. I mean, um, there could be some trivial issues that we disagree with the Catholic Church and some of its prudential decisions, and it's probably not wise to nitpick the church and criticize every one of those things. However, if there are some serious concerns, I do think that it would be important to vocalize some of them. I'll give you an instance. What if, having studied the issue very thoroughly, you're under the impression that the magisterium, or the teaching authority of the church, though not exercising its infallible magisterium, but exercising its authoritative yet non-definitive magisterium, what if you're under the impression that that such an exercise has contradicted something else that the magisterium previously taught,
Hmm.
and you're concerned that the magisterium made a mistake here and has not um, accurately guarded and preserved that previous teaching. Um, Now, again, we're speaking in the context of something non-infallible, non-definitive. So we're not talking about a failure to preserve something essential or infallible. We're not talking about that kind of dereliction in the church's duty, but we're talking about potentially the church in a non-infallible capacity or even a disciplinary capacity, failing to sufficiently account for something else that the magisterium has said that demands our assent and that is authoritative. I could see a person who has studied the issues very well to make sure that that's the scenario. Um, I could see them expressing some concerns to their bishop, to others, to the Pope, and hoping that maybe by expressing those concerns, the church will take a second look at this and help either reassure us that there's no contradiction here, or will resolve this matter of conflict.
Hmm.
But that's a far cry from like public dissent and undermining the church's teaching authority and things like that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I certainly, what I'm about to say, I don't mean to sort of judge the motivations of people who do it, because I imagine it is guided by that kind of sense of kind of like righteous anger.
Yeah.
We have to jump. I do really think it
Yes.
is, and I've talked to many. I mean, I have many friends who are drawn to that type of thinking. So I'm speaking about people that I really do love
Yeah.
and know well
Sure.
too, right? It's not just people. I mean, I most of the people I love, I disagree with, right? So,
Yeah.
so that's just sort of the nature of life sometimes. But it also does feel like there is this, and maybe it's incidental, unintentional, I
Mhm.
don't know, but this sort of fanning of flames in order to kind of like foment a bigger following, to kind of, to get a
Mhm.
rise out of people, to kind of get attention. I mean, some of me thinks that this is sort of just the sort of the dangers lurking in digital media, kind of the nature of using digital media as an
Mhm.
evangelization tool. Like, it's not a matter of like whether we should use it, right? We certainly should as
Sure.
Catholics, but we have to be mindful of how, and like
Sure.
how does that medium impact the message, right? I mean, there's something there, right? And if maybe there's something that, like, just the nature of kind of, getting views and followers, like you have to
Mhm.
kind of be
Mhm.
more and more, I don't know what the word
Mhm.
is.
Yeah, push the envelope more and more. Yeah, in some
Yeah.
instances that may be a factor, but I agree with what you said also earlier that I think in many cases people really do believe that they are helping the magisterium safeguard the deposit of faith. They really do believe that something the magisterium currently says is in conflict with something in the past. I'm sure that that's a motivation for many people, but that motivation can go a little too far where they set themselves up as the guardians of tradition instead of the magisterium. And I will say in most of these cases that people express these grievances with the magisterium and say, look, the magisterium is contradicting this. Well, look, Pope Francis is contradicting this on the death penalty, or Pope Francis is contradicting this on communion for divorce and remarried. In most of those instances, it's usually by being done by somebody who's not a well-trained theologian who has actually looked at the issue sufficiently. It's usually being done flippantly by somebody who thinks that they know what they're talking about, but in fact they haven't studied it sufficiently, and so what they're doing is they're causing a concern on social media that really shouldn't be there. And that's why Donum Veritatis is specifically, when it talks about this case of one withholding assent in some rare instances, it's specifically talking about theologians who have done due diligence in researching the matter. It's not referring to just everybody who's on social media who hasn't really studied the issues well. So while I'm sure the motivation in many people's minds in expressing their concerns online, and I think sometimes it goes beyond that, it goes into dissent. I'm sure the motivation is they think that they're helping the magisterium, return to tradition, but in reality I think they're just aggravating the situation, and in reality there actually isn't a conflict between those two teachings. I'll give a perfect example. You'll often see people say that Lumen Gentium and Vatican II, and what it teaches in paragraphs 14 through 16, and what it teaches about non-Christians,
Mm.
it is in conflict with what the church prior to that, perhaps Florence or even Boniface VIII in Unum Sanctum, it's in conflict with these things on this topic of salvation outside the Catholic Church and the relationship of non-Christians or non-Catholics to the Catholic Church. They'll say there's a contradiction here. That's a really famous one. And in many in all these instances, I would say these individuals are misinformed. There's actually no contradiction here. There's continuity. Um, so for them to express that publicly, they're in error.
Yeah.
But I mean, of course, they don't think they're in error, so they're going to express it publicly.
So
So
that's
that's part of
interesting.
the
So,
problem.
well, so maybe though I'm trying to think. So if we're trying to convince someone who
Mhm,
is convicted, so to speak, to share this kind of this error, like
mhm,
would we address it as like in principle the public nature of the criticism is just like like that's just the wrong way to go about it. So like yes, let's like address this, but let's take it offline,
mhm,
so to speak. Like is it kind of like that's kind of how we first approach it, or is it like no, there is, if it were indeed the error that they think it is,
mhm.
it would merit the response that they're giving. Like I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to like unpack. Like if
Yeah,
they were right, like would it be meriting this type of response? Like if sort of,
yeah.
I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's sort of
Even
speculative.
if they're right, I don't think it merits the kind of response we
Mm,
often see because it tends to be vitriolic um, presentations of public dissent against the magisterium, which I don't find to be very helpful. So even if they were right, I don't think that they're going about communicating it in the best possible way in many instances. Obviously, I'm painting with a broad brush here. There's always exceptions. Um, so that's even if they're right, but in the vast majority of these instances, I don't think they're right anyway. And so there's two problems here. Not only are they theologically in error, but then I don't think that they're handling it in the best possible way. If they're right, the best possible way to handle this is follow Canon 212, paragraph 3, and Donum Veritatis. And if you follow that, you're not going to have these nasty vitriolic presentations of public dissent and calling people to rebel against the Holy Father or even separate from communion with the Holy Father, which is schism. You won't have those things.
mm.
You'll rather have mitigated challenges and concerns expressed towards the magisterium. So I think there's a huge difference. So yeah, even if they're right, I don't think they're doing it in the right way.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's I think that's a really helpful distinction, because it really is like there's a principle, at the heart of it, about just sort of the nature of our disagreement. And I mean, it's so interesting to me because I mean, this authority, this hierarchical authority of the magisterium was a true deterrent to my becoming Catholic for many years, right?
Hmm,
Like it was a huge obstacle for me.
hmm,
And so it's so interesting to me because but it was also something that I viewed as a non-Catholic as an essential obstacle to overcome before becoming Catholic, right? So
really?
once
Okay.
I was convinced of the authority of the magisterium, and in
Hmm.
particular with the Pope at the head of it, and the College of Bishops in union with him, then to me it was like so many of the rest of the dominoes fell, right? I mean, at that
Yeah.
point, like then the
Sure.
Mariology started to make more
Hmm.
sense, and then all
Hmm.
these other things. I'm like, well, look, this is the hierarchical structure. This is the
Hmm.
authority structure that God has put in place to guide the
Hmm.
faithful throughout history. So it would make sense that, these types of things, right? So I say that because for me it's so interesting, because like to be now a Catholic and to be see self-proclaimed Catholics dissenting and effectively calling into question, that very fundamental domino that toppled so many other dominoes for me. It's a hard one, because it's like I didn't become Catholic because I liked the Pope or didn't like the Pope. Any
Hmm.
of the last couple popes. I mean, I've liked. I guess I'm
Hmm.
not. I'm not here to kind of. I don't. Hmm. But it was
Well,
but their authority as as the Bishop of Rome, right? I mean, their role as the successor of Peter, like that was just like an indisputable aspect of Catholicism. So it seems to me, to some extent, like when these overreactions go too far, they're effectively like eroding the very foundation upon
yeah.
which their faith, or they're calling into question, at least whether they mean
Yeah.
to or not. I don't think they do. But it's sad. It's hard to see, kind of. It's hard to witness, both as a Catholic, but then also because of the public witness that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, yeah. You're effectively indicating that they're undermining the credibility of the Catholic Church. Yeah, I agree. Not only that, but also the indefectibility of the church in some instances. I think they're undermining that. But as far as undermining its credibility, yeah, this is a really good point. And I think what will happen is some of these individuals will say, "Well, no, I'm not undermining the credibility of the church because," and they will limit the obligation of assent merely to infallible teachings. And they'll say,
Mm.
"Well, look, the Pope didn't teach it ex cathedra." So, kind of in their minds, if unless the Pope teaches it infallibly, ex cathedra, or unless an ecumenical council teaches it infallibly in some solemn definition, then you're free to just completely ignore it, reject it, bash it, publicly smear it all over. You can just do whatever you want. And I want to say, no, no, there's a middle ground here that the Catholic magisterium actually requires you of, middle position here, and that is, it's not, well, if it's not infallible, you can just do whatever you want. There's the middle category of, well, in non-definitive or non-infallible teachings, but that are authoritatively taught. So it's not some private opinion of a pope. They are taught with authority by the pope. You are required to submit to it with your intellect and will, religious submission of intellect and will. And rarely are you allowed to withhold that assent. So in their mind, they're thinking, well, I'm not undermining the credibility of the church because I'm only obligated to assent to these infallible teachings. But in reality, no, you're obligated to assent to all these other things. And that is actually all these other teachings. Those are the way that the church normally teaches. The
Mm.
church doesn't normally infallibly teach, it normally teaches non definitively. So if you get to just reject all this non definitive stuff, what are you really left with but a handful of instances of infallibility? It just severely truncates and then undermines the credibility of the church, because it just basically means, well, you have to submit to the magisterium in a couple of these instances, but everything else in 2000 years you can ignore.
Yeah,
And you can imagine why the Protestant wouldn't be very impressed by the magisterium at that point.
absolutely. Absolutely true. And it's basically, it's kind of like acknowledging or nominally assenting to a principle while sort of effectively, you know, I don't know, sort of knocking over the very structure that whole principle leads to. It's an interesting thing. So
But
what
it's
would
the
you?
Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
go
Go ahead.
ahead. No, please.
Well, I was just saying it is the impression, however, that we're giving non-Catholics. I heard a well-known Protestant
Mm.
apologist. I won't name his name. I don't know if you want me to, so I won't name his name. But well-known Protestant apologist the other day said, "Well, look, the Catholic Church is only taught through the Pope infallibly twice, and
Mm-hmm.
so basically the papacy is useless because he's only taught infallibly twice, and so you don't really even need a Pope because he almost never teaches." And to which I want to say, well, first of all, I don't even accept that he's only taught infallibly twice. But even if that's true, there's this whole other category of non-infallible papal teachings that one is obligated to assent to, and that is very important
Oh,
to the papal
absolutely.
magisterium. So it's not like, so it isn't the way he presented it, but that's certainly the presentation that some Catholics are giving to non-Catholics. So when they hear us and they want to then evaluate the Catholic claims, they're then refuting a straw man, but we're the one giving them the straw man.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, and I think I think that probably really is what I think this needs to keep coming back to is we have to be incredibly mindful of our public witness, and that includes, of course, how we are. I mean, the Catholic claim is credible, right? Like, of course
Mhm.
it is. Like, otherwise, you and I wouldn't believe it.
Sure.
But we can make it appear incredible because of our presentation, and that's a true danger. And it makes me think a little bit just of kind of like how we approach this, right? I think perhaps there's an overemphasis on when it's permissible to criticize among some groups,
Yeah.
and less of a focus on the how that criticism is done. And I think
Mhm.
about temperance, right? I mean, like so many times I just see and hear vitriolic. I mean, that really is the word. I
Yeah.
mean, you used it earlier. It's sad that that's the word, but I think it's accurate. And yeah, it's that sort of that lack of temperance that almost like it's an immediate red flag of like there's something like off here. Like even if what they're saying is true, like the way it's being said is so the animosity. It's just like kind of it's almost
Mm,
and sometimes it's more scathing, right? Sometimes it's sort of like openly angry. Sometimes it's more scathing, kind of like the sarcastic. Sometimes it's kind of just like the snide
mm.
remarks that kind of erode credibility in their own way, about the poking. And it's interesting though because I think about this. Everything that I just said applies to all of us in all of our interactions, right? So there's a certain
Yeah.
extent that just like us as Christians, us as Catholics, like in the world, we're called to evangelize through our actions. Absolutely, right? I mean, it's how absurd is it, right? If we, know all the wonders of theology, right, but don't have love, we are nothing,
Sure.
right? I'm paraphrasing, but you
Sure.
get the point. I think that's really important. Something I think about a lot, and yet we are called indeed to present the truth in its fullness. And I think that you brought up a really interesting point just there about like our doing a disservice to Catholicism by not representing it in its fullness, right? In a sense, by
Mm.
under emphasizing the role of the Pope and those types of things. Um, so it's that kind of like the love and truth balance, kind of. I don't know. What do you think about that? It seems to be kind of like a presenting the truth, but in love, and that's
In
the
love.
the
Yeah.
point of tension. I don't know, or that's the way to navigate the point of tension, I should say.
Yeah, I think if we balance truth and love, as St. Paul says, and as you mentioned here, that would help a lot because what I'm noticing is that not only are some of our critiques vitriolic, as we're noting here, but then we're also very quick to criticize things that
Mm,
do not deserve criticism, and it's based on a disposition of rash judgment.
mm,
And in fact, I would quote to you, I have it actually pulled up right here. I would quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2478, so 2478, that I think is very applicable here. It says this: to avoid rash judgment, everyone should be careful to interpret, insofar as possible, his neighbor's thoughts, words, and deeds in a favorable way. You always try to interpret people in the most favorable way, but rather, in many instances, what we're doing is we're engaging in what scripture calls evil suspicion. We're looking to interpret people in the worst possible way, especially the Pope in many instances. And so we're then quick to jump on social media and say, did you see what Pope Francis just said? Did you see what this bishop just said? And we don't really give them the benefit of the doubt or look for a favorable judgment. We automatically look for the worst possible interpretation and then we throw them under the bus. And I don't think that's helpful. The Catechism continues. It says this: every good Christian ought to be more ready to give a favorable interpretation to another statement than to condemn it. But if he cannot do so, let him ask how the other understands it. And
Mm,
if the latter understands it badly, let the former correct him with love.
mm.
If that does not suffice, let the Christian try all suitable ways to bring the other to a correct interpretation so that he may be saved. And the motivation here is for the salvation of the person,
Yeah.
not to condemn them and treat them horribly.
Oh, I
In
love
so
that.
many ways, I don't think we're following this right here from the Catholic Church, this Christian principle.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you for reading that. Yeah, that's it's really wonderful. I think that captures what we're saying, and as the Catechism
Mhm.
is wont to do, and it's just such beautiful language. And one of the things that struck me, I don't know if it was step 2 or 3 in there, but it was the
Mhm.
clarifying question, right? Like if you do suspect that your brother is in error, like it was like follow up and ask. It was kind of like,
How
and I think
he
that
understands it. Yeah, ask
yes,
him how
yes,
he understands it.
I love
That's important.
I love
Because
that. Let
then,
them articulate it in their words
yeah,
before putting your words in their mouth.
right. Because then you might find out that that person actually understands it in an orthodox sense. So if there's something that maybe sounds heretical, somebody says something that sounds heretical, if you ask them to clarify, you might then find out, oh, okay, well, I see what they were getting at. They're actually not teaching anything heretical. They're accounting for something else that I didn't think about. And what they're saying is actually orthodox. Um, but if we're not doing that, we're immediately going to just rashly judge them. Well, we're going to assume that they're teaching heresy, and we're going to throw them under the bus, and we're going to publicly criticize them and then tarnish their good name and defame them, which is a sin, frankly. So it's something we have to avoid doing.
Absolutely. No, I think it's yeah, the motivation and the sort of the posture. It seems to be like the posture, of course, the motivation being grounded in love, but then also that kind of like the posture of humility and service. And the other thing that was struck me about that passage that you read was sort of the end of it, right? Like the persistence in lovingly trying to correct them. Because it was they actually
Mhm.
want genuinely to have the end result
Mhm.
be true conversion. As we all have as a goal, and it's such a beautiful thing. It's not to prove the other wrong or to have a triumphalist kind of view of discovering truth, but to lord over others, but a true like genuine concern and desire to have
Yeah.
someone else come to the truth. And of course that's motivated of course in Christ, right? Christ is the word of God, incarnate, and that's our true representation of truth embodied. So I mean, if we think about that, the presentation of truth, right? I mean, the presentation of the word uh
Hmm.
came through the incarnation. I mean, there's some beautiful symbolism,
Hmm.
I think, symbolic connections there. um
But could you imagine, if the intention here is that we're correcting someone so that they may be saved, could you imagine maybe Pope Francis watching some of the criticism that people offer him online? Do you really think he's going to get the impression that that person wants him to be saved? In many instances, unfortunately, I don't think he's going to get that impression. I think he's going to think, wow, these people really hate me. And so that's
yeah.
part of the problem. Are we really, do we really intend to communicate these things for the edification of the body, or is it rather to just tear someone down?
No, I think you're absolutely right, and it really makes me think of, and I think this is I don't think it's a uniquely American problem, but I can certainly speak about it kind of from my American perspective. The tribalistic tendencies that have seemed to seep into
Mm.
all discourse, really. I mean, all kind of public discourse. I mean, we think about it in terms of politics, right? The sort of the political tribes, but I think it's become more of a way of thinking in a lot of
Hmm.
senses, right? It's almost a way of approaching conflicts, right? And I think we see that a little bit here, because I couldn't help but think about when you talked about um, people who are willing to criticize Pope Francis without giving him the benefit of the doubt. The same people typically have someone who is their champion, regardless of what stance they are, regardless of what
Sure.
reactionary movement they're part of. They likely have a champion of their own that they would actually defend in a very different manner to the way that
Hmm.
they're criticizing Pope Francis. So to me, this seems that there's sort of a cognitive dissonance, and I think it's probably related somewhat to that Pope Francis has been relegated to that role of other, right? Like they're part of this group and he's the other. He's in that other camp. There's this mentality. And once you do that in your mind, you're not attacking your brother in the same way. It's a weird kind of thinking. I don't think any of this is
Yeah.
conscious, right? I'm kind of, psychoanalyzing people, and that's a
Yeah.
dangerous thing
Well,
to do
I
broadly.
mean,
But I've done it,
not
so I can talk about myself at least. I'm sure I've done it.
Oh, I've been guilty of this as well.
Yeah.
That's why I've kind of had to retrace my steps from my pseudo traditionalist days. And I think that in many cases, not only do some people see Pope Francis as other, but they see him as enemy. They see him as antichrist, or the forerunner of the antichrist, to use some people's words. They see him as waging war against the Catholic Church and waging war against Jesus Christ. And so they kind of go to that mentality of interpret him in the worst possible way, because after all, this is the guy preparing the way from the Antichrist. I mean, if you really believe Pope
Yeah.
Francis is that, you're probably not going to avoid rash judgment. You're probably going to read him in the worst possible way.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And I would expect it for people outside the church, of course.
I would too.
Just
Yeah,
you
sure.
would hope it doesn't also have to be within.
Well, this is why a lot of these individuals are leaving and have left the Catholic Church and gone to
mm,
Eastern Orthodoxy or atheism or Islam. This is exactly why.
yeah. So what would you
So,
say to those people? That was kind of one of the things I've been wondering is, what advice would you give to those who are struggling with this? And people who are sincerely struggling with this, right? Like let's give our hypothetical people the benefit of their doubt ourselves, right? And assume that they're genuinely struggling, genuinely reacting to what they see as
mhm,
scandal. And maybe it's because they have an entirely warped presentation of this because of the echo chambers that we all reside in.
mhm,
But that's another thing.
mhm.
But yeah, what would you say to them, like to encourage them? What should they do
Yeah.
next? Yeah.
My recommendation is retrace your steps,
Mm,
because you'll likely continue to experience this wherever you go, or are currently in. So if you've left the Catholic Church, you're going to continue to experience these things, because the bigger problem is rash judgment, things like that, setting yourself up as your own magisterium. So you're going to continue to find these same problems no matter where you go, because you're going to experience the same problems anywhere. So my recommendation is retrace your steps. If you're under the impression Pope Francis is waging war against Jesus and hates the church and hates tradition, that's a warning sign. That's a red flag. You've bought into some things that are not true. Retrace your steps.
mm,
What it is there are some legitimate criticisms against Pope Francis in this pontificate, but what it is what has really led you to that position is not the legitimate criticisms. It's a cacophony of numerous claims that you've read on social media, many of which are not true. You've bought into claims about Pope Francis, of what Pope Francis said and what he intended, many of which are not true, but you've bought into it because you've heard it so often on social media, and you have not scrupulously questioned those comments. So, in other words, there's a heightened sense and a heightened emotional sense of Pope Francis is this horrible person, because you've just been exposed to so many of these claims that you've just bought into and should not have. Again, that doesn't mean that at the end of the day, once you retrace your steps, there won't be any criticisms left. There will be. There will be criticisms left against Pope Francis and this pontificate and any other pontificate. But
yeah.
what you'll realize is the vast majority of your impression that you have about Pope Francis or anything else in the church, such as maybe Vatican II, the vast majority of those negative impressions are artificial. They're contrived. They're not legitimate. They're just simply things that you have heard from others and you've taken for granted, and you need to retrace your steps and dig deeper.
Mm, yeah. I love that. I think the retracing your steps is really powerful. It reminds me of something that the priest who was responsible for my catechesis emphasized a lot. He kind of talked frequently about establishing that foundation upon which you can rely in terms of like our intellectual journey. He was a Thomist priest, so he
Mm-hmm.
was approaching it from a very, from like that
Mm-hmm.
kind of built out perspective. But it was really fascinating because he was like, once you have that foundation intellectually, right? He's like, you're
Mm-hmm.
welcome to kind of dive out into the water and kind of go play with ideas, so to speak, because you know kind of what that foundation is. You know what's solid, so you know kind of
Mm-hmm.
where you can tether your lines to, so to speak, in a sort of intellectual and theological sense. And I think it's really a powerful thing because if you find yourself kind of out too far, kind of,
Hmm.
that's when you get into danger, right? When you're not tethered to that foundation. So I don't know. I know I'm speaking kind of like in an imaginative sense, but it's really important. I think that retracing of steps concept that you said. I think there's a lot of really practical value for that, because it's necessary. That the conclusions that we've come to are indeed tethered to that foundation of truth, that foundation of Catholicism, right? So if we kind of
Hmm.
find ourselves in this state of confusion, that retracing of steps, I think, can help identify where we went wrong, right? I mean, I imagine that's kind of the goal of it.
And that's what I did. I
Yeah.
asked myself, what led me to this conclusion? And I knew I thought of several instances that led me to that impression about Pope Francis and the post-conciliar church as a whole, and what led me to look to Eastern Orthodoxy. And when I reevaluated those examples or those instances that led me down that path, I realized in each one of those cases, um, I was not necessarily um, drawing a conclusion or an impression based on the facts. It was more based on what people have said about the facts, the impression that they've caused and they've presented, or half truths to the neglect of other information that I wasn't made aware of that would completely give a different impression. So maybe I've heard some things that, yeah, it wasn't just merely opinion. There is some evidence for this, but the problem is that evidence was considered in isolation to these other bits of data that I needed to consider that would make me form a very different opinion and draw a very different conclusion. But I just wasn't aware of those things. So in every one of those cases, I had to retrace my steps, and it's not something that happens overnight. It takes time. But once you do that, you'll then realize, wow, I came to an impression about Pope Francis and the post-conciliar church that was unfair in many cases. And in a few instances, I realized, oh no, that was a legitimate criticism. That one still remains, but all these other ones don't. And so that changes my impression very significantly.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So I know we've talked a lot about kind of how to criticize well, things, dangers and doing it wrong.
Mhm.
What would you kind of say if you wanted to kind of on a positive side, how would you exhort Catholics to maintain unity during these times of confusion? Maybe regardless of kind of, where they're coming on. But like what do you kind of wish Catholics understood about this? Like Catholics who are participating in these public, disagreements and things that are actually sowing
Mhm.
confusion. What would you tell them, to kind of exhort them to
Yeah.
pursue unity, even if they're confused, even if they're frustrated?
Sure. Focus on essentials. Don't make mountains out of molehills. Don't really worry about having major disputes over accidental or side issues, things that are not essential. Number two, we mentioned it earlier: truth and charity. Don't just be so focused on the truth that you forget or to the exclusion of. Um, you're wanting to present this for the salvation of the other person, not necessarily to treat them as the enemy. That's something we all struggle with, but keep it in mind. So truth and charity. Don't make mountains out of molehills. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else. Those are two things that come to mind offhand.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think maybe I think I've got a couple questions in the chat. So
Sure,
if you have time with that, that'd be great. I think my
sure.
kind of maybe my last question though, just to kind of I think it might be a nice segue is
Hmm.
I just asked about what do you wish people within the church kind of understood, or what would you say to them? What do you kind of wish people outside the church understood? People who are kind of like seeing these public disagreements. What do you kind of wish they understood about? I don't know, the issue that we're discussing here.
Oh, and that was another thing, because this reminds me of with your previous question. I would also ask Catholics to consider how do your words and how does your position appear to non Catholics? Is
Mm,
this going to be
yeah,
something that's a barrier for them? If this is going to be a stumbling block for them to come to Christ and His Church, then yeah, you may have gone wrong here.
yeah.
You know,
Well, the
it,
Bible has
it,
harsh language, right? I mean, it's like better to. I mean, what is it like? Cut off your
mhm,
something than
mhm,
cause
mhm,
your brother to stumble. I mean, it's like very like visceral language, like no
mhm.
no soft
Yeah,
terms.
yeah. What you see with Saint Paul, for instance, is he'll say, sure, the gospel is an offense to Jews and Greeks, that is, Jews and non Jews. The
Mm,
gospel is an offense. And okay, so be it. If the gospel is going to be a stumbling block, that's something we can't change. But We don't want to be a stumbling block and an offense. If the gospel is, if the truth is, so be it. But we don't want to be an offense in perhaps the way we present it or something like that, or things that we impose on people that are not essential. Um, but you then asked a question about, I believe it's my advice to people in the Catholic Church. Could you maybe rephrase it
Oh
one more
yeah,
time
no
for me?
no worries. Yeah, I'm just curious about kind of what do you wish people outside of the church actually
Oh, outside.
would understand? The people that are witnessing this, right? With the people that we've been bad examples to, right? The people that we Catholics have added
Hmm.
to their confusion, perhaps. What do you kind of wish they understood, or what would you tell to them?
Yeah, nobody has it all figured out, so don't necessarily use a particular person in the things that they do to judge Catholicism by. Judge Catholicism by the actual claims of the church itself, not necessarily a particular individual. So, if the Catholic Church maintains, based on Scripture and sacred tradition, that it is a teaching authority and has the authority to teach in the name of Christ, judge the church based upon the merits for those claims, not necessarily based on how many Catholics believe that, how many Catholics are actually following that, whether Catholics are saying things that are inconsistent with that. You're always going to have people who are unfaithful to the covenant that God has established. You see that in the Old Testament, you see it in the New Testament. So in the New Covenant period, it's going to be no different than it was in the Old Covenant period. So just as you had people who were faithless or offended God or disbelieved in the Old Covenant, you're going to have the same in the New Covenant. But in the same way that faithless people or sinners in the Old Covenant would not somehow discredit the need to be part of God's covenant community and the
Mm,
truth of that covenant community and the claims that it makes about God. Same reason for here. I mean, just because you have people in the Catholic Church who are wrong or do wrong things or do bad things doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't want you to belong to this covenant community. That is His church, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the teachings of the church are wrong. It just means that people are sometimes inconsistent with that. So judge the church based on its actual claims and the merit for them, not necessarily based on how people behave.
No, I think that's really important and helpful. And I know you'd mentioned previously, and just again now, the kind of the truth claims at the center of that, like focus on the truth claims. What is Catholicism
Mm-hmm.
actually claiming is true?
Mm-hmm.
Not what Catholics are. Not how Catholics are failing to live up to the truth. But of course, that being said, none of that is ever meant to kind of diminish the very
Of
real
course.
pain caused as a result of it, which is why we're having this entire conversation. I think in some
Yeah.
sense, right? It's like, how do we, as Catholics, how can we better defend the church, in a
Yeah.
sense, right? And I think we have to be mindful of that. The optics are so important. I think maybe now more than ever in our digital age, right? Like, because this isn't just like one conversation with a neighbor down the street, that
Mm-hmm.
might tell one or two people. I mean, we all have the potential to reach thousands or hundreds of thousands of people with relative ease nowadays. I mean, it's not like a snap your finger, but easier than it's ever been, certainly. So the stakes are higher than they have ever been, I think, in some sense, of sort of just the digital landscape and the sort of the
Mm-hmm.
impact that our messages can have in that digital landscape. In some sense, I feel like the stakes have never been higher. Now, for good and bad, right? I mean, in some sense, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, how wonderful is it? Like, I mean, from Fulton Sheen to Bishop Barron to yourself, and like just the way we can like access people and spread the word and get messages out there. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But
Mm-hmm.
so too are the bad messages being spread in the same, at the same scale and same level, right? So it's
Yeah.
just an interesting thing. I was in a class this summer about media and evangelization. So this is like, if you can't tell, the digital the digital vessel and the connection between medium and message is very fresh in my mind. So I didn't mean to steer the conversation that way, but it just kept happening naturally.
Well, it's a helpful point. I mean, because social media can be used greatly for the kingdom of God and proclaiming the truth, but it could also be used significantly for a lot of destruction. And you mentioned that we might reach thousands of people. That's true. And not only the let's say we do a video, we reach a thousand people. Well, then those 1,000 people, if they hear something that is false and destructive, some of those people will then also go out and reach others, and those people will also go out and disseminate error to others. And so the reverberation here, the consequences of it may extend beyond just simply the immediate audience that I engage. Those people may also then go and spread error. So there's a lot of consequences to
Absolutely.
spreading error. So we have to be really careful.
And the scriptures warn, right? I mean, there's sort of like there's a high amount of pressure and responsibility for those who are teaching the faith, and I think
Sure.
that's really important. Something we're trying to take seriously. But yeah, so I guess let's see. I had a couple questions
Mhm.
pop up. Let me just scroll back to them. So one of them, I think I can add this to the broadcast. So living in the internet age where it seems everything is up for public discussion and debate, how can we Catholics be making sure we are not becoming overly critical of the church or its ministers? And I guess this actually probably connects a lot to what we were just kind of like just talking about now with the internet age.
Yeah, how can we make sure we're not being overly critical? Yeah, well, number one, avoid rash judgment. Number two, make sure our motivation is for the salvation of individuals. Number three, make sure we're well informed. Because in many instances, what it is that we're willing to criticize is probably a misunderstanding on our part, due to a lack of study on a particular topic. I mean, there's been so many instances where I've misunderstood a person, and it was rather a problem of ignorance on my part. And it turns out actually that person was correct. I just only found it out after I did the studying, and so, making sure that we're properly informing ourselves before rushing to criticize somebody.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. That kind of brings us back to that kind of like the temperance, the virtue of temperance, and it can be easy to rush to judgment,
Yeah,
and maybe that's one of the dangers of being online, right? We can think we actually have all the information, but we don't. Just because we have access to so much information doesn't mean we actually understand all the context, and um, that's a danger. I feel like it's very easy nowadays to kind of assume we have the full picture, but we have a very it's a very remote image that we're getting, right? In our digital perspective, most often at least.
there's somebody who said, "You don't know what you don't know," and I found that to actually be helpful because when this person said that in the context in which he said it, there was something important that he knew that nobody else knew. And he was only vindicated later for his position. And I'm remaining vague here, but my point is that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And those things that you don't know may radically change your position and your opinion once you find out about them. So always keep in mind, you don't know what you don't know. You could be missing something really important, a huge piece to the puzzle that changes everything.
No, you're absolutely right, and no, that's really wonderful because I mean that's absolutely what happened with me and my journey to Catholicism, right? It was, I mean, I've kind of jokingly said this. I think it was when I was on Gary's hands-on apologetics,
Mhm.
was talking about that, and I kind of jokingly said it's basically just like a series of misconceptions I had cleared up,
Yeah.
and it was like kind of like
Mhm.
it's sort of like a cheeky way to
Mhm.
describe what was actually like a really long and arduous like intellectual journey, but it kind of was that, right? It was I sort of like
Sure.
stumbled my way into Catholicism by stumbling my way into Orthodox Christianity in a sense, right? Which is kind of what Chesterton talks about a little bit, like almost like realized eventually that like his vision of orthodoxy was indeed represented represented in
Mhm.
the Catholic Church. It's an interesting thing. I don't know where I was actually going to go with that, but I do have a couple more questions. But one thing I wanted to jump back to just real quickly, when you were talking
Mhm.
about the impact, right, that what we were saying
Mhm.
can have and how we can reach so many people. It reminds me of just like a little anecdote, which I think has some truth to it. I don't know if the numbers are right. Statistics are always a silly thing, but I used to work in restaurants and bartended for years, kind of before I
Mhm.
finished college. That's how I paid my way through school. And I remember we talked a lot about the restaurant industry, like people's perception, right? If they have a good experience, they might tell one person. If they have a bad experience, you can better believe they'll tell
Sure.
10. it was
Sure.
like an amazing, it was like an
Yeah.
exponential though thing. That's the
Yeah.
whole point. Like maybe it's not 10 to 1, maybe it's 2 to 1, maybe it's three
Sure.
to one, but it is exponentially different. The amount of
Yeah.
people they will tell about a bad experience versus a good one. I think this is really, there's some real wisdom there for us in the kind of the online apologetic space, right? Like, if we say good things, right, like yeah, we might impact people, but if we say the wrong thing, or if we like really get something wrong, like it's gonna be exponential, and it's a sobering reality, and it's I don't know, there's something
That's
there.
very true. That's really true. I mean, we know that to be true from our own
Oh
experiences when we
yeah,
have a bad experience at a place of business. So we know that to be true.
it's absolutely right. I even think about, the Catholics online. I mean, the ones that bother me are the ones that come to mind more often than the ones that actually like I enjoy sometimes, and that's a problem. I think that's a character flaw. I'm not saying that's like a good thing, but I think it is a reality that's worth worth reflecting on, being mindful of. So um yeah, so one of the questions I got in my Discord channel. Oh no, not my Discord channel. I apologize, Kyle Whittington, if you're listening. In Kyle Whittington's Discord channel, I don't want to take credit for that, which is not mine. But someone was asking a really good question. If someone is approaching you outside the church, right, like your friends or
Mm,
family, and they're genuinely concerned about the scandals. We're thinking more like sex scandals and just all of the sort of the abuses of church authority, whether financial or otherwise. Um, it's easy, I think, and often the case that the characterization of Catholicism becomes that it is a scandal-ridden organization. I mean, they kind of become, it's like the move very quickly, I think, goes from there are lots of very real scandals to this is a scandalous organization, right? I think that's the secular characterization. What would you kind of do? How would you encourage a Catholic who is trying to have conversations with those people? Of course, without undermining any of the very real damage. But like, where would you direct them? Like, how would you kind of point them? Are there resources? Are there ways to approach that conversation that kind of you know do it
mm,
justice, but without at the same time not letting that very real anger at very real problems lead to a mischaracterization, because overreactions can sneak in all sorts of ways, right?
mhm.
And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a few that come to mind. I mean, I've heard this, position of a scandal-ridden church, and I think that's an overstated position. But there's certainly, uh, a fair amount of scandals in the church, so I understand why they feel that way. But I would say let's be careful not to overstate the case. But number two, I would also ask a person to be consistent, because when we look at the Old Testament, there are all kinds of wild things going on there. And yet we would say, well, but that didn't discredit the message of the Old Testament nor the covenant community of God. And if we've already accepted that, if we've already said, well, I accept the truth of the message of the Old Testament, and that if I were alive at that time, I needed to worship the one true God, Yahweh, and not the Baals and not the Molechs and so on. Well, if that was true then, in light of all the scandals that were going on in Israel, in light of all the people in Israel who were worshiping the Baals and the Ashtaroths and all that. If you could accept that then, why is it you're having a difficulty in doing so now? Well, I'll tell you the why. It's because you're experiencing the chaos today, whereas you didn't really experience what was taking place in the old covenant. And likewise, I would say the same thing for many periods in church history. If you were experiencing some of the scandals that were taking place in perhaps the 10th century, you would certainly feel a heightened sense of scandal. But as somebody who perhaps is already a Catholic, well, you would already accept that part of church history and say it doesn't disprove the claims of the Catholic Church. Well, okay, if you believe that for then just again be consistent,
Mm,
and recognize that maybe one of the reasons why you have that heightened sense of scandal today is number one, because you're experiencing it,
mm,
whereas you didn't experience things in the past. And number two, you also might be buying into some misinformation that has caused an exaggerated and
yeah.
heightened sense of scandal. That's not to say that there isn't scandal. I've experienced it, so I know firsthand that there is. But the point is, though there may be scandal, Sometimes you might have an impression that is exaggerated because that impression is formed by some of which is misinformation on social media and people repeating false claims, and it gives you the impression that there's a scandal here when there isn't, and
Mm,
that just adds to the existing scandal meter that continues to grow every day the more you read social media.
yeah.
So just be cognizant of that is what I would say.
No, I think that that's a really helpful, yeah, that's a really helpful thing because it's a balancing act, right? It always is.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think when we're talking about something that is so just offensive to to our virtues, it's easy to kind of just like nod the head when these over exaggerated characterizations come. And I think that there is a healthy pushback, while at the same time, of course, acknowledging all that is true and real. Um, yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. Um, so I think maybe to just try to wrap it up here in just a minute, but maybe end on just a little bit more of a positive note rather than kind of talking about scandal at the end. I don't know.
Hmm.
But what advice would you have for someone? I mean, I think you, as someone who has undergone multiple sort of changes of mind,
Mhm.
as kind of working through new information and kind of considering it and changing your mind. There's a lot of sort of inherent instability there, right? In those sort of conversion processes, those sort of intellectual
Mm.
changes, adjustments. Um,
Mm.
do you have any advice for someone, just to kind of how to maintain peace, kind of in these kind of discerning processes, whatever they're discerning, whatever kind of intellectual conversion they're going through? It's an upheaval. How do we kind of maintain our peace in these kind of
Mhm.
moments of upheaval? And you can answer however you'd like, but I'd love to end on
Sure.
that kind of peaceful, positive note.
Certainly a helpful or a healthy prayer life and scripture reading life, but
Mm,
also recognize that you will eventually be given clarity. For years, I wondered, why is God allowing me to go through all of this confusion? I just continue to experience so much confusion surrounding where is the true church. And there's so many historical claims to consider and doctrinal claims to consider. And I can't possibly consider all of this data within one lifetime. It's humanly impossible. And so there was just this constant for years, well over a decade, in fact, of confusion and wondering, why is God allowing this? Um, and then I realized there was a period of clarity, which continues to this day. But there was um, an interesting period of clarity where I got the answers to my most fundamental questions, to where I gained moral certitude
mm,
over them, right? Nobody can have absolute certitude of most things. And so I gained a moral certitude that brought about um, a great deal of peace and helped take away a lot of anxiety. And I realized, wow, it's interesting because for all those years, I wondered, why is God allowing me to go to this confusion? And now I'm realizing why. Specifically, I'm realizing so that I can help others who are going through that,
mm.
which is why I tend to focus on those things on the show, helping people who are going through that. Um, and so it added up, and I saw, well, this is why I had so many questions surrounding Protestantism, or so many questions concerning Orthodoxy, and so this is why I wrestled through all of these various views. It's so that I could help others. Who are also struggling through those things. And so just know God will bring you clarity if you are faithful and persistent, and it's happening for a reason. God will bring about a greater good from it.
I love that. That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And I think that distinction between sort of absolute certitude and the moral certitude that you
Mm,
that you
mhm,
uncovered is a really important one. And I think sometimes our desire for absolute certitude in the sort of almost a divine sense is it's a understandable. I can certainly understand the desire, but it's a dangerous desire. It's a Faustian desire in a lot of senses, I think, almost, or it can be. So I think that's a really important thing, kind of leaning into the moral certitude and finding peace in Christ, through the chaos, so to speak. And maybe there's something there, right? I mean, clinging to that foundation, clinging to, I mean, as a Christian, clinging to Christ in the process of discerning, clinging to that what you know to be true. Like even if you are kind of out there in the water splashing around, not quite sure, which shore to end up or whatever. I'm going to butcher the analogy, right? It's going to die somewhere, but it's like you can know that kind of like you have the certitude of that foundation. Like once you have a foundation, right? Assuming you do. So yeah, there's something there. So oh, Michael, is there anything else that you want to kind of add to the conversation? Anything else you think kind of is worth covering? This has been wonderful.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. I think we covered everything in essence, but thank you so much for having me on. These were excellent questions. I
Oh
really
man,
enjoyed them.
well, you're very welcome, and thank you. I mean, I feel it's my pleasure. I mean, the luxury of doing this channel as kind of a side thing is I'm legitimately just exploring ideas that are fascinating to me, and able to like do that with people who know so much and have so many kind of like relevant connections to these topics. It's just really fascinating to me. So I feel very fortunate to be in this position for sure. So for those listening, is there kind of what? So I know Reason and Theology, right? So everyone go
Mhm.
follow Michael on Reason and Theology on YouTube. I believe you. That's where I follow you. I'm guessing. But
Sure.
what else should they do? Anything else you want to kind of? Are you working on anything else that you want to mention right now?
Well, I do have a book that's going to be coming out soon, engaging Eastern Orthodox objections to Catholicism. The book is finished; it's almost done with
Ooh,
the
exciting.
editing process with Catholic Answers. So they will be publishing that soon. I do not have a date yet, but I think it's going to be sooner rather than later. So maybe just keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Congratulations in advance.
Thank you.
Imagine that's a really, really exciting accomplishment. And I'll look forward to reading it for sure. So that's also worth mentioning, right? I mean, you're also an affiliate apologist for Catholic Answers.
Sure.
So
Right.
that's great. I think I mentioned that or failed to mention that in your intro, um, but man, this has been wonderful. Seriously, thank you again for taking the time to talk to me. And yeah, just God bless you in your endeavors, and look forward to continuing to talk with you.
Thank you. It was an honor. I really enjoyed it.
All right, thanks again.